It really does clear things up. If you're living and being that story, what a great way of providing leadership and just centering from kind of telling something to being something. I think that also describes our next speaker, Rhonda Mims, who is with Paul Hastings LLC, where she runs corporate social responsibility, but throughout her career, whether as a litigator or working on environmental and civil rights or building projects honored by the Clinton Global Initiative, this is a speaker who has lived that and is now bringing that to a great law firm. So please welcome Rhonda Mims.
You're so sweet. Thank you. Oh my God. Thank you. Thank you, and good morning. I have to say that my voice is leaving me, so hopefully it'll last for 10 more minutes. And I don't necessarily need that much help, but I had recent knee surgery, so that's why I had all the care getting on the stage. So I grew up in a very small town on the border of Georgia and South Carolina. And I can remember the very first time I had a conversation about race. It was with my mother. And I had to be about 8 or 9 years old. And this is a picture of me and my cousin Danny. And we were at the local grocery store with my mother, and I happened to run across a classmate, a white classmate. Her name was Melissa. Melissa was in the far aisle at checkout, and I was with my mother. And I immediately turned to go walk toward her because I wanted to say hello to Melissa. Just great seeing her. My mom grabbed my hand and said in a very nonchalant manner, "She may not be able to say hello to you here." And I didn't necessarily know or knew what that meant, but I could see Melissa out of the corner of my eye, and her mother was holding her very intently, and she was whispering something in her ear. I don't know what was said, but I know Melissa never looked up at me. She never came over to say hello, and I didn't dare go over to say hello to her because of what my mother had said to me. So when I got home, my mom wanted to explain it all to me. It was such an awkward moment, and she wanted to shield me from future hurts and indignities. So my dad was at work, and my mom sat me down, and she explained living in the South and what that meant for us. So some 40 years later, here we are. So now you figured out how old I am. And has there been change? Absolutely, there's been change. Unfortunately, the recent incidents that we see today, such as, I guess, the Charleston 9, or what happened recently in Paris, or Freddie Gray, or Eric Garner, and the list just goes on and on and on. All those things are threats not only to the Black community, but to mankind in general. And obviously what happened in Paris is about intolerance and not understanding the value of inclusion and recognizing the value of people and the differences there. So have we changed in corporate America? I would say absolutely, but is there more work to be done? Sure there is, but the dialogue has changed. No longer do we talk about race when we talk about diversity and ethnicity. We now can talk about gender identity. We can talk about veterans, ageism, generational diversity, religion, and the list goes on and on and on, because we have evolved as a society and we have evolved in corporate America. Of course, though, talking is one thing. The real action occurs when there's some real change. So this is a picture of what I would say is the Fortune top 25 companies. And if you look, yeah, there's been some change. There are 3 women running our top 25 companies. But in the Fortune 500, you might be surprised to know that right now there are 22 women, 5 Black, 9 Hispanic, 1 LGBT self-identified CEO, and we have to count 1 person twice because she's Black and she's a woman. So in total, there are 36 minority CEOs in our Fortune 500 companies. So what does that mean? That means that yes, there's been some change, but there's more work to be done. And as I was preparing for the talk with you today, I thought about, what is it that would make the most sense to share with them? I'm sitting in my office in New York, and I realized that there was a quote in our office bulletin. And the quote was from the great corporate leader, Jack Welch, "Change before you have to." And I thought to myself, immediately, this is it. This is what I'm going to talk to this audience of social innovators about, changing before they're forced to do so as it relates to diversity and inclusion in their corporate world or in their NGO or their nonprofit. And I was enamored with that quote for whatever reason. But as time went on, I became less and less enamored with it. And the reason for that is because, as I think about it, it's more punitive and unopportunistic than it is something that drives inspiration. So, how many of you are parents? Raise your hands, okay? I have a 10-year-old. And leave your hands up. If you ever use this phrase, keep it up or I'm going to send you to your room, okay? Does that work all the time? No. So that's what change before you have to actually feels like as it relates to diversity. Keep it up or I'm going to send you to your room, I'm going to punish you. But that's not a reason to drive diversity. So the quote that I think makes the most sense these days is a quote that's fairly old, something that was shared by Stephen Covey, writer and businessman who wrote the widely successful The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Strength lies in differences, not in similarities. And today you will hear people say, diversity drives innovation. Diversity does drive innovation, but it's all about the differences that we have as a people. Our workforce is changing, regardless of what institution you work for. In short, our world is becoming more dissimilar all the time. By 2040, ethnic minorities will be the majority in the United States. Women are more than half of the population and 41% of the global workforce. According to Morgan Stanley, in a recent study they did, women control $11.2 trillion of US investable assets. Blacks and African Americans have about $1.1 trillion in purchasing power. The LGBT community represents about $790 billion in purchasing power. So if for no other reason, don't change because you have to, change because you have an obligation to your shareholders to remain competitive. Regrettably, too many companies wait until they're forced by market conditions, or they wait until there is a discriminatory lawsuit or class action or a regulation or change that requires them to change. And oftentimes, when they do so, it's incremental, if not more, yet cosmetic. So it should not be laws or a threat of a protest that requires you to change and think about your diversity journey. We should be compelled by the essential and fundamental understanding of the changing nature of our world. What we like to say at Paul Hastings, whether you're selling products or human capital, diversity is just good business. So let's talk solutions. For the last 15 years of my life, I've worked at corporations, global corporations or firms that have given me the portfolio of corporate social responsibility. And usually within that portfolio is responsibility for diversity and inclusion. I like that work, I enjoy it. But sometimes, and there are days when I feel like it's a nice to have, but not necessarily an essential department. And so it is time for us to think about it in a different way, to reassess and revalue diversity and inclusion. Even though, again, 15 years ago, I worked at a company that was a US healthcare company. They had a chief diversity officer 15 years ago. I am absolutely stunned that today there are industries that do not have a chief diversity officer or do not have strong diversity efforts. And it's one thing to hire a diversity officer, but you have to hire the right person who understands that they can drive business by tapping into a consumer population that hasn't been touched before, an underserved consumer base. Or they can utilize the workforce to drive change in products and services that they design. Or they can themselves serve as representatives for people in the pipeline, as leaders who could eventually get up to the ranks because of where they sit within the organization. My mentor and the person that brought me into the diversity and inclusion world is the CDO at a major technology company in Seattle. And what she shared with me is that the value of what you bring to the table is bringing your authentic self every day to the workplace to demonstrate that your value is in your differences. So it's incomprehensible that we're still trying to figure out how to have the diversity dialogue in some industries. But don't just hire a CDO, support the CDO. Make sure that that CDO or that person who's running your diversity efforts sits on the C-suite or sits in a position within the organization that she has the capabilities or he has the capabilities of actually effectuating change. So to that end, I'm coming to a conclusion, but I have a couple more things I want to say. I serve on the Executive Leadership Council Foundation Board, and the Executive Leadership Council is the premier organizations for African Americans who are in the top of their companies, in the Fortune 500. So you report 1 or 2 levels below your CEO. So you could be in a Fortune 500 or a big professional services organization. And what we're doing at the Executive Leadership Council is focused on blacks. It's focused on getting more black CEOs through a CEO Academy, and we've created a Leadership Institute. It's focused on creating a board initiative around getting more blacks prepared to serve on corporate boards. And it's also focused on what we call the C-Suite Academy, getting more blacks into the C-Suite. So that's just what we're doing with blacks. There are tons of other diversity organizations out there that are preparing the next generation of diverse leaders, and we have to do more of that, and we need your support. So finally, to those of you who hold influential positions in your companies or your NGOs, what is your diversity profile? Can you ask yourselves many of these questions on this list and feel good about the answers? Do we have diverse points of view at the table where important decisions are made? Do we have a handle on the changing nature of our customer or client base? Do we truly understand the diversity and inclusion opportunity? What are the roadblocks and encumbrances to building a more diverse and inclusive workforce? What are we doing to hold our suppliers accountable? And finally, what are you doing to hold yourself accountable? Who have you brought up within the organization that doesn't look like you, that you've supported and gotten them into a position where they can drive change? In conclusion, I'm sure you're all dying to know what happened to Melissa, my white classmate. I would love to stand here and tell you that Melissa and I are lifelong friends, that we talk on a regular basis, we go to the spa and we hang out. The truth of the matter is, Melissa and I were friends until we were in junior high. And whether you subscribe it to the fact that there are societal norms or parental interventions or hormones, we stopped being friends, and I found her to be relatively annoying. So I cannot say to you that there's a happy ending to the story, other than to say that Melissa served as an object lesson for me, one that I will always and eternally be grateful for. Thank you.